Yeah, so I take the position that feminism is absolutely destructive to society. The only healthy society that we can have is a patriarchal society. If you look at the history of the world, the history of civilizations, we notice that the natural formation, the natural structure that all societies, almost across the board, maybe a few tribal societies have had a matriarchy, but most societies fall into some form of natural hierarchy. Hierarchy is found in nature. We see it in the animal kingdom. We see it in the manimal kingdom that we inhabit. And when we look through history, we find certain civilizations have flourished, particularly with a worldview or a philosophy that gives it its social cohesion. The longest running civilization in history, the most successful, the most prosperous, was Byzantium. Byzantium was an Orthodox Christian imperium dating back to the time of Constantine all the way up into the 1400s, when it fell to Islam due to liberalization, due to forms of modernization, certain economic open borders policy, shall we say, that led to the decline of Byzantium. So even in the most successful civilization in history, in Byzantium, we begin to notice that the liberalization of that society is what led to its decline and its eventual collapse, and even falling to Islam. If we fast forward to modernity, if we look at women's rights or the idea of the first wave of feminism, feminism finds its origins in French revolutionary philosophy, which led to the first wave, I should say. French revolutionary philosophy with Mary Wollstonecraft and others posited the idea of absolute equality in society based around the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, all of which were revolutionary at the time and sought to overthrow not just the church and not just the state or the monarchy or a patriarchal society, but all society, all areas of life had to be revolutionized. Since that time, we've had second wave feminism, we've had third wave feminism. Third wave feminism, interestingly, which not many people know, was actually funded by very wealthy, powerful oligarchical elites. In fact, in the Rockefellers' authorized biography, there's an entire chapter on Abby Rockefeller's funding of third wave feminism and Cell 16, which was the most radical form of this. This is really what prepared the way for the absolute insane degeneracy that we see in today's society. Western civilization, in other words, could not have gotten to the point that we're at had we not had first, second, and third wave feminism preparing the way for the absolute and total revolution against all natural order, all biological order, and the notion of patriarchy itself. In fact, many of the famous feminists over the last several decades have openly said that in order to destroy Western civilization, they would have to destroy the masculine archetype, the patriarch. That is, God the Father had to be destroyed to make way for the rise of the goddess, etc. All the various things that we see attending to or accompanying the revolution that is feminism. If you look on my wall on X right now, you'll notice at the very top is an interview that the famous director Aaron Russo did with a friend of mine, Alex Jones, and in that interview they discuss Aaron Russo's interview with Nick Rockefeller. And Nick Rockefeller said that the greatest tool to revolutionize and control society was feminism. Modern feminism changed the landscape of getting women out of the house, into the workforce, quote, so that they could be taxed and that there would be less children, less families. So we have from one of the key elites from the Rockefeller family admitting that the purpose of this was to change society, reduce population, tie it into neoliberal economics, taxation on a mass scale for the population, and thus it has been an absolute disaster. And it has nothing to do with equality. It has to do with control. It has to do with social control. It's dystopian. It has to do with social dystopian control, putting us into a utilitarian technocratic society. And I would say that this is all an attempt, admittedly, if you go back to people like early feminists like Wollstonecraft or others throughout history, Alexander Kollontai of the Bolshevik Revolution, they all speak about this as intimately tied into not just sexual revolution, but the overthrow of masculinity, ultimately the overthrow of the idea of God the Father, the ultimate patriarch. And that's where we are today, is in a society that has adopted revolutionary philosophy that is ultimately anti-male, anti-biology, anti-reality, because they all go together. In other words, feminism cannot be divorced from the revolution against biology, the revolution against masculinity, the revolution against every area of life that is healthy, wholesome, and based around patriarchy.
All right, thank you for that, Jay. Kyla, would you like to give your opening statement now.
Sure. Mine isn't going to be nearly as long, but I was really interesting, and I basically would grant you lots of that stuff. I would essentially argue that feminism is not only a necessity, it's unavoidable. I think that's where society tends to go. I think women joining the workforce, while there's lots of cons with it, one of the biggest pros is the massive boost to GDP and just the competitiveness of every nation that includes women. And overall, I think feminism is broadly good for society, but I am sure that I would be happy to talk with you about a number of areas that I think have been harmful for society. I think feminism has been co-opted and often twisted. I think particularly in the third wave, we saw this by what I would call gender opportunists. And so when I think about feminism, I'm more interested in a feminism that is centralized around empowering women and promoting femininity. I think when you talk about egalitarianism, I think it's a really interesting concept, but I think we need to be precise in what we talk about. So I guess to open, I'd maybe start with a question. With your philosophy background, I'm sure you're familiar with Heidegger's concept of chatter.
No.
Okay, so Heidegger is an interesting philosopher from the 40s, but he has this idea of chatter that I think is really interesting for discussion, which is essentially how a lot of times when people have like philosophical and idea wrestling conversations, they use the same word, but they have different meanings for those words. And so then the whole conversation is just essentially garbage. That's what he calls like idle chatter. And so I'm curious if what you'd be willing to do for this conversation is if we could make sure that we agree on what we mean by certain words so that we can actually talk about the ideas underneath them and hopefully come to a better understanding of everything.
What are the words you would like specified or
probably for
clarified on?
this conversation, we should talk about patriarchy and feminism. Those seem like the most obvious things to define. And then after that, just if we come to a word that we keep both using, it would probably just be useful to define it and make sure that we agree to what we're talking about, if that works.
Yeah.
Okay.
Would you like to start with your definitions and then Jay can give his?
Sure.
Or
So,
see where you guys agree?
yeah, I'm curious. So patriarchy, I would define it as a hierarchical structure where men monopolize soft and hard power.
I think that they have authority. I wouldn't say it's a monopoly on power because women can have a degree of influence and power in society, but it's under the headship of a man. So, for example, a job, right? As an example, Proverbs 31 talks about women being able to work, but it's sort of under the purview of the husband. So it's not independence, it's not doing their own thing, it's a family unit working together, so there's roles.
Sure. So when we're thinking about like a job, so when I think about a monopoly of hard and soft power, in my mind I'm thinking law, like kind of like men are mostly monopolizing positions in law, but also soft power like media and kind of able to kind of set the tone culturally as well. So they kind of have these areas of power mostly fully occupied by men, particularly systems where men force it to be the case that it's only men in those positions.
Yeah,
Do you
it's
feel
just
like that's
monopoly is a difficult term because it suggests totality, and again, there can be a shared situation here that's not a total monopoly. But
okay.
Fine, I'll go with it. It's fine.
Sure. We can say like a soft monopoly or something like that.
Okay.
But essentially a hierarchical structure where
That's
men
fine.
tend to mostly occupy positions
That's
of
fine.
power.
Sure.
Feminism, I define it as the empowerment of women and promotion of femininity. Do you agree with that, or do you have a very different definition of feminism?
I think of it as something necessarily tied to revolution, and I think when you say the word empowerment, it's also ambiguous because that could be a lot of things in different contexts. So I don't know what you think empowerment is.
Okay, so by empowerment, what I mean is typically going to be, I'm a very big freedom of opportunity person, liberal, guilty as charged. So empowerment would be eroding any obstacles to disadvantages or inabilities to take opportunities that other people would have. That would be one way of empowering someone.
So, for example, there was a TED Talk about 10 years ago, and one of the ladies who was a diehard sort of CEO out of the academic world, she went into academia and then became a CEO. She was bragging that most CEOs now, this was again about 10 years ago, are now women. That we're reaching some tipping point, that there's a large majority of women that are now CEOs. Do you think that's good? Is that fair? Because I would see that as a revolution against male authority.
I see it, I am very dubious of her claim. B, I see it as like neutral. I don't really care who trickles up to the top, so long as the people who trickle to the top did so because there was free opportunity to do so, right? So like in our society, I'm sure here's something we probably agree on. Most of the positions of power in our society are occupied men because men tend to be more extreme, like they're just more extreme in bell curve, like genetically. And they don't often take time away from work with kids, so they have a little bit more time to dedicate. So we see at the highest levels of trickling to the top, men typically occupy those roles. I'm sure you and I would agree.
Yeah, but when you say extreme, again, this is a very ambiguous term. Extreme in their views, extreme on the bell curve.
Sorry,
those
I
are
meant
two different
genetically.
things.
Like, so because of the Y-axis specifically, so I don't know if you know anything about IQ research, for example.
I know some about that. Yeah.
So men, while like obviously the average IQ for men and women is 100 because it's normalized, men tend to occupy a bit more of those extreme spaces. They're both the lowest and the highest IQ. And we see men doing that all the time. They tend to just have more extreme genetic traits, both for success and for struggling, right? That's why we tend to see men overrepresented on both sides of most things. So that's why men often will trickle to the top of most workspaces, for example.
And you think that's because of extremes of IQ?
Well, not just IQ. That would be extremes of multiple things. And also, I think I
You
said...
said IQ a minute ago.
Yeah, IQ would be one thing. I just don't think IQ is the only thing that would predict you trickling to the
so
top.
what are the things that led men to be in those positions other than IQ?
Probably just the ability to work. Like they don't take time away from work for children. Their wife typically does
Could
that.
there be anything biological?
Well, IQ
Would that be biological?
IQ would be something biological,
It's
right?
partly biological, but I'm saying like in terms of what a man is biologically, is that anything to do with what might be roles in society, hierarchy?
I don't think there's super good evidence that like testosterone predicts like anything other than like aggression towards those like equal or lower and like muscle distribution. I think it's a lot more going to be...
Muscle distribution is part of biology, right?
Sure, I just don't think like muscles get you to the top of a Fortune 500
What about
company.
like being a soldier? Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why men are significantly better soldiers than women.
But what about that high IQ, that group of high IQ? Does that help get them to the top of the CEO ladder?
That would definitely help. I think it's like a 45% to 60%
And you admit
predictor.
that that's partly genetic?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So it seems like naturally speaking, when I appealed in my opening statement to what's natural and biological, men are just sort of fitted to those things. Their very constitution
They often
is
trickle.
for those things.
Yeah, it's just with in 2025 with women having birth control and tampons, there's less obstacles to that, so they might trickle to the top too. And I just want a society that would allow them to do so.
But why? That's what I'm getting at is if this is biological and thus, quote, natural to a degree, according to what you're arguing, what's the need for women to do what is then perhaps not natural for them to do in society?
Because there are lots of women that are still in the high IQ realm that are very capable, that make excellent bosses.
So exceptions make the rule?
No, more like freedom of our opportunity, right? That's my premise. Is I
So the
want
okay.
It's like the innovator scale, right? I don't want to arbitrarily just say 50% of our society cannot be at the top of society because I want to make sure that if they're achieving the top of society, it's because of skill and merit and et cetera, et cetera. That's what I believe in. And so I wouldn't want to arbitrarily ban women from those positions.
Right, but it's not, I didn't even talk about banning, so that was something that you interjected. What I said
I'm not saying you did, right? Because you were asking like what I'm interested in. I'm saying a freedom of opportunity for women to just trickle up.
So there's a standard, which you would say that's a net good for society if women are able then to interject themselves into that male space.
To be allowed
that's
to.
That's a good?
Yeah.
Why is that a good?
Like I said, innovator scale.
What?
Innovator scale. More people means more innovators. You just get the best of the crop.
More people. Mm-hmm. So we should have more people in society?
Sure. I don't know if this is connected to birth rate.
Well, yeah, because the more people in society would then back up what you're arguing, right? But don't we need more husbands and wives to have more people?
Yeah, I just don't think these things are mutually exclusive.
How can a wife be a CEO and also raise the kids?
Tampons, birth control, like supporting.
So tampons and birth control raise the kids? What do you mean?
Lots of women find a way to both raise children and work.
Well, there
shared
can-
parenting, like the husband takes roles. Sometimes they get babysitters. Sometimes there's intergenerational families. There's multiple ways that women share the load of parenting.
So that's a net good?
It can be, yeah.
Okay.
Freedom of
What
opportunity.
is the standard for good here?
Do you mean like at an epistemic level?
At any level?
Good as in
your worldview, what determines the good?
so in the case of what we're talking about, I talked about the innovator scale. So the reason I like women being able to have access to opportunity is because it improves GDP.
Okay, so the net good for society is just what? More fiat money? Like what determines that?
Yep, GDP is a good thing. Do you disagree?
Yeah, I do.
You don't
Because
think
first
GDP
of
is
all,
good?
like what if the money is a scam?
That doesn't have anything to do with GDP. Why would not having more GDP for a country not be good?
The nature of the money itself, if the money system is a debt-based scam, doesn't have anything to do with GDP?
Not really, because GDP is about like the income of a country, right? So like debt is part of how you navigate income of a country.
Right, but our country's income is presently based on pure debt, right? Is that a bad thing?
Our GDP is not based on debt, no.
It is. Well, the whole system is based on debt. Gross domestic product is not itself debt. I'm saying the economic system itself is based on debt.
Yeah, like
Because it's
MTM.
a debt-based system.
Yeah, like modern theory of like money is very debt organized. It's just like debt is not this like boogaloo scary thing in and of itself.
No. I'm talking about our system is fiat. It's not attached to anything hard. There's no hard currency that our money is attached to since the shock doctrine of Nixon, right? So
Yeah, of
Nixon
course.
goes off the gold standard. So we're now a debt-based system. So I'm just saying your highest quality was the best GDP in society. So your organizing principle is a neoliberal economic theory. So what I want to know is, even if that's itself based on debt, then what's the source of the good here?
So in this case, what is good for society is having a competitive GDP so that your enemies can't stomp
That's
you.
the highest good?
That's not the highest good. That's the good of what I'm talking about in the case of women entering in.
What is the
innovator
highest
scale.
good that determines that that's good?
Are you talking about morality?
Just at all, in your system. You tell me what your system's standard of good is.
So I'm not really sure why we're having the epistemic conversation. I
Why
guess
not?
Because it feels like we're losing the plot of the conversation.
No, I want to know what your standard of the good is.
Again, what do you mean by good?
You said that the GDP is necessarily attached to the highest good.
I didn't say highest good. I said it's a good thing.
Okay, then I'm asking you what the highest good is that determines that the GDP is better than not caring about GDP.
So you're asking for my moral foundation theory?
Sure.
I'm a divine
You tell
command
me.
theorist.
From what divine command?
The Christian God.
And he says GDP is good?
No.
Did Moses come down and talk
I don't
about
think GDP is moral.
You just said it was the highest good
I
for
didn't say it was
this
the highest good.
This debate.
No, I said it's good for society.
Then it's moral if it's good.
I don't think it's moral in this case.
If it's good, it's moral.
Well, you can have good
The
as in
good
functional.
is a moral claim.
Well, of course, you can have functional claims, right?
So if it's only functional or if it's only pragmatic, then it's not ultimately a good. It's just subjective.
So at a functional level, it is, I guess, do you disagree with this idea that it's good for a state to have competitive high GDP?
It could be, but I don't think it's the highest good, and I have a standard of good. So I'm trying to figure out what yours is.
Well, what's more important for a nation state than GDP?
The health of the society.
Sure, but if the health of society is really high,
I mean, could you have? Let me give you an example. Could you have a society that's a mass addicted to drugs but has a good number, a nice income?
probably not.
No, you can have societies that are full of detriment, like full of ghettos, and they're ruled over by organized crime that make a lot of money.
Typically, those countries, like if you're thinking about like the Congo or like areas that have like high levels of corruption, their GDP is horrible because typically crime is not good for GDP.
But I'm saying you could conceivably have that. It doesn't matter whether there's some exception to that rule somewhere.
It's not
in the
exception. I would say
Congo.
the rule is, in general, when you have lots of corruption and drug addiction, it's not good for GDP.
But I'm saying conceivably you could have a ruling elite that makes a lot of money from drugs, and the society itself is living in shantytown, right?
I
They're
don't
living on
think that
Skid
that
Row.
nation state would have high GDP. I don't think there's any evidence
It
that that
doesn't
nation
matter
state.
if you think that, because it's conceivable that you could have that, right? You could have a successful oligarchy that makes a lot of money, and the people themselves don't do very well.
Are you talking about like Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, sure.
Sure, but Saudi Arabia, again, is not nearly as competitive as somewhere like America or any NATO
Well, again,
country.
how do we know that competitiveness for women is a good? You've just said that that's the case because it increases GDP.
So I'll just break it down.
So it's a circle.
Okay, if we're going to do
What?
we can do Agrippa's trilemma. It's just useless. I can use it at you too, right?
Well, but if I'm arguing for a moral ought on the basis of
This is not a moral ought.
It is. You said it's a good. If you said something is a good.
I said it's functional.
Yeah,
what word? Okay, we're doing chatter.
So
what
now
word do you want me to use when I say functional?
No. In a debate, if you're arguing for your position, then you're necessarily arguing that we ought to follow your position.
Yeah, I think I said
so
it's
it
a
is an ought.
necessity and an unavoidable. That doesn't
So
mean
it
it's
is an ought.
It doesn't mean it's a moral claim. It would be like realpolitik.
Well, then it's an ought, because do you think we ought to follow your
Not
arguments?
all oughts are moral.
Ought we follow your arguments?
As in, like, should you do what I prescribe for society?
Ought we follow the true arguments versus the false arguments?
Sure.
Okay. Then you're using an ought right now to argue for your position.
Sure, but this isn't a moral claim.
You just argue that we ought to follow your position. That's
It's still not a
claim.
moral claim.
It is.
It's not.
Oughts are morals if you're extending them to everybody in the theoretical realm of listening to the debate.
Do you think that it's
So we ought
moral
not?
or not moral to have GDP? Do you think GDP is moral?
I'm pointing out that your
Could you
position.
answer my question this
I have
time?
a different system than you, so
Do
it's
you
not going to
think-
apply to my system.
Do you think that GDP is moral?
Everything in life is conceivably or potentially moral.
How is GDP moral?
Because you extended it to, in this argument, the highest good.
I did not.
You walked it back after
no,
I asked for the highest good.
No.
Yes, you did.
I did not.
You
I said
said
for
in
a
this-
nation state, I guess it's like one of the higher goods. Yes. It's not the highest good. And I've said,
So, and what is the good?
Jay, I don't know how to explain to you over and over that this is not a moral claim. It's realpolitik.
You're saying that?
It's pragmatism.
You're saying that, but ought we follow your argument in pragmatism here?
If you want a flourishing society by and large.
So we ought, logically.
Sure, but it's
Ought we logically?
It's not a moral claim.
It's not.
Is GDP a moral claim?
It can be depending upon
How?
the system.
How is GDP a moral claim?
In your system,
How is
you're
more-
arguing that what you just said we ought to follow your arguments.
I don't know how many times to tell you this.
Yeah, but
I'm not
you're
making
confused.
a moral claim.
You are,
I'm
and you're
not.
saying you're not.
You're just keep telling me that I
Anytime you
am.
say that there's an ought,
That's not true.
that is true.
No.
It is.
No.
Even if you redefine it as
Okay,
functional.
how about this? You don't
because-
have to have a liberal society that has a high GDP. You're just going to get stomped and you'll be a failed nation state. It's neutral morally.
Yeah, but you're missing the point about highest goods for society. You're arguing that.
I'm not engaging in that yet.
Wait, hold on.
Well, that's big. Go ahead.
Oh no, just if you guys can try. If you guys can, just try to let each other finish your thoughts. But go ahead.
So this debate necessarily comes down to metaphysical claims and epistemical claims and ethical claims.
No.
Yes, it does.
We can
because
go- so we can go
feminism
there.
is about morals, ethics, biology, society, social relations. You can't divorce ethics from that. Now, if you think you can, I'm happy to address that, but that's just going to get you in an even deeper bind.
I'm not saying that you can divorce these things. Of course, feminism
You just
has moral
argued a
things.
minute ago that it's not moral.
GDP is not moral.
Then you can't divorce these things. So you just contradicted yourself.
So there are lots of elements. Okay. There are lots of elements within feminism that do make moral claims, right? Lots of them. When I'm talking about something like an innovator scale, it's not a moral claim. It's realpolitik.
I understand you
it's
think
pragmatic.
that, but I'm pointing out that it is still moral. That's the argument I'm making.
Okay. Do you want to engage with the actual conversation now?
You saying that doesn't avoid the argument I'm making.
Okay.
I know that's what you're
Why
trying
is
to do.
GDP not good for society, or is it?
I'm saying it depends on your standard of good,
What
and that's
about
what I'm
your-
asking you. What
what's
the
your
standard
standard
is.
of good, and do
I
you
think GDP can be great for a society, but it's not the highest good of society.
Sure, I
such
agree
as
with that.
the social cohesion of society. That's more important than who's making fiat money.
Okay, what do you think is the role of the nation state? should it
The
do?
nation state has the job and the duty to defend its people and to maintain a healthy society, to punish the wicked, and to reward virtue.
Sure, yeah, I would broadly agree. It's to keep its citizens safe, right? Okay, how does it do that at a
But
foreign
I
policy
said reward
level?
virtue and punish vice. So there's also necessarily an ethical component there.
Sure, that's your claim.
Right, that's my worldview.
Yeah, I'm just engaging with it.
Right.
Okay, so then how does your nation state and your worldview protect itself from enemies?
It has a standing army.
Okay, and how does it fund that standing army?
Well, nations have gone into debt, or they have been prosperous and used their own treasuries, or they have raised money to go to war. So there's a lot of different ways that could happen.
Okay. And so what do you think is the right way to do that?
It's an oversimplification question because not everything in regard to warfare or history of civilizations is necessarily right or wrong. It's a question of what might be the best or the worst. So there can be scales. It's not
Would you
all
say that
either or.
there are some things that aren't moral necessarily? Some of them are just pragmatic, and then there's some things that are moral?
Everything could potentially be moral, but some things are pragmatic, sure.
Okay. That's basically what I've been saying.
Yeah,
So
but you
we
were
got there.
appealing to the good of a nation state.
You were, again, because you were using the word good in a way that I wasn't meaning it. And even though I clarified multiple times that I meant functional, and I even said, what word would you like me to use to
but
describe this
I
pragmatic
understand that
concept?
you think that saying that because it's functional, it removes the ethical domain, but it doesn't, is the point I'm trying to make. Because the
language-
question that we're debating is whether feminism is good for society or not. That's
Sure.
an ethical, moral
Okay,
claim.
so going back to the chatter thing, how we have to agree about words, okay? You're now essentially assigning to me what good means, and it's obvious that I'm not
No, I'm
agreeing
doing an
with
internal critique is what I'm doing. You know what that
You're
is?
assigning to me.
Do you know what an internal critique is?
Tell me.
So I'm criticizing your position on its own grounds. That's an internal critique. That's what happens in debates.
Okay, what word would you like me to use when I am describing this non-moral functional element that is
The
about
one
nation
that
state?
makes a non-moral position makes sense of why feminism is a good for society.
We can get there, but again, we have to.
You're not going to get there.
Well, we can, but you're not even like we're doing
Because-
chatter. We're literally
No,
we're doing the thing I
at the
asked
point
not to do.
where you don't understand the issue. That's the
That's
point.
not true. All you've done at this point is just like you're just weaponizing
No, you
Yes.
admitted that the debate is about whether feminism is good for society. That's a moral, ethical domain right there.
Sure, there are some moral elements.
So when you make
and
arguments
some
about
functional
GDP,
arguments.
if it's not moral, then it's not relevant to the debate.
It's absolutely moral. What language would
It's
you like
moral?
to use? I said it's not. There is moral elements and there are some non-moral elements. GDP
Is the debate today about something moral?
I don't know if I agreed to saying we're only going to talk about epistemics and morality. Good is, again, this word that we're basically doing chatter around, where you're assigning a label to it, and I haven't agreed to
I'm
it. We can
trying to
just-
figure out your position on the good.
My position on the good is it's holistic. There are things that are good because it's functional, and there are things that it's good
Mm-hmm.
because it's moral, right?
Is the debate today, feminism, about the good of the moral for society?
It's about, I guess, I would like to
Yes.
make the case for both.
The answer, okay. So
Functional
then
and
that
moral.
means that everything you've been saying for the last hour is wrong.
No, because I'm making a case for the functional element too.
But the fact that you're making the case for the functional element too doesn't matter if you're also talking about the moral.
You can make both arguments, and I would like
Correct.
to engage in the first
Yeah.
one.
Right, because the other one is the one I'm looking at, and that's the problem for you.
It's not the problem for me. The
Yes.
problem with this conversation is that essentially what you've done is you've assigned me a bunch of positions that I don't have.
No.
You've done a bunch of circle talk about words. You've done a couple of rhetorical flashbangs. And now we're stuck in the situation where we can't actually talk about the ideas, which is unfortunate because I was really
Because you
looking
spawned
forward.
into you're chasing, like one foot is nailed, and then the other one is going in a circle, like a cartoon. You're
the
like
issue-
like
if
a
you want-
cartoon
again,
character running in a circle.
If you want to like throw Agrippa's trilemma at me, you can, but I can throw it at you too. And if we do that, then there's no point. We're at an impasse. What do you think is good?
The good ultimately relates to God, the highest good.
Okay, the highest good. So is GDP in direction of that or not?
All things that exist are good in some way, and in some way relate to morals. But I do not believe that the GDP is the highest good for society.
Okay, what is the highest good for society?
The health and flourishing of the society, which has to exist within some kind of patriarchal norm. That's the only way that it can function.
Gotcha.
And the ones that don't, they dysfunction.
Okay. And so in your mind, does GDP contribute to any of that?
It's just one component of life, just like, I don't know, the size of the nation's landmass is one component,
Sure, I would agree with that.
but it's not the highest good.
Okay, gotcha.
So what's the argument that feminism is good for society?
Feminism is good for society at a functional level
Uh-huh.
because it increases innovator scale. I also think it's the right thing to do.
That's moral oughts.
Yep, I'm giving you a moral claim now.
Okay. Thank you. And why is it right for society?
It is right for society because I think in general we should try to treat others well, and I think limiting people's opportunity by force is bad for them. I don't think God wants that.
Okay. What God?
The Christian one.
Okay. Where does he talk about this?
Forcing people to do things?
No, this idea of what the good is for society, because we have a lot of historical Christian societies.
Sure.
Were any of them feminist?
No, but I don't think in general that
Oh.
God advocates really strongly for a political system.
Really?
No.
What about when Israel was organized? Was that a political system? What did they
Like
have?
in 1948
No, in the Old Testament.
in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Was it? Yeah, it was a political society.
How was it organized?
I'm not a Jew.
What does that have to do with whether it was organized in a certain way or not?
It has nothing to do with my claim.
What does the Old Testament say about how God organized that society?
He gave them prescriptions about how to run their life from Moses.
How was that society organized?
It was organized, I believe, in a patriarchal society
Yes,
with matrilineal
correct.
heritage.
And it was a monarchy,
Yes.
a male monarchy.
Yep.
Okay. So, in that regard, God was not feminist, right?
I've never said that God was feminist.
Well, I'm asking if there's a history example of where God organized a feminist society.
I mean, it's interesting because when you look at like ancient Judeo history, if you're not being presentist, it was like insanely progressive compared to like the pagans around them, like the Assyrians and Babylonians.
That's not what I'm asking.
Well, it is what you're asking.
You're calling
right?
it progressive, and I would just say it's healthy. So the fact that they,
Sure,
had,
yeah,
the
like
ten,
God,
they had the Ten
God
Commandments.
seemed to advocate to some degree for a better treatment of women than any other society
I
around
agree.
them.
But that's not feminism.
To some degree, you could argue that it is if you agree with my definition, which is like the empowerment.
Well, but your
and
definition is so
promotion of
elastic
femininity.
and broad that it could be anything
But you agreed
except
to
for
it.
what my position is. No, I don't, because I'm not agreeing that Old Testament patriarchal society is feminist. You just admitted it's not.
If you're not agreeing, why did we even define the words at the beginning?
Can
if
you
now you're
name
just
a
rejecting
feminist
them?
society
I'm not
that
interested
God
to.
advocated?
I'm not interested to.
You appealed to God.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing to treat women well.
Did God ever? That's not feminism. Now you're equivocating.
I'm not equivocating.
Yes, you are.
How am I equivocating?
You're changing, moving the goalposts as to what feminism is.
That's a completely different
so
fallacy.
If God
So am I
has,
equivocating or am I moving? Hold on, am I equivocating or am I moving the goalpost now?
It's both.
It's
You're
both.
equivocating on the word and moving the goalposts to make your position work. So if there's no feminist,
not what
if there's no
equivocating
feminist equivocating on the word,
That's not what equivocating
I know what
means.
equivocation means. Yes, it does. It means that two different understandings of a word. You're equivocating on the word.
Okay.
Feminism, and you're defining to say that if God in the Old Testament gives women rights, that's feminism. That's not what feminism is. Feminism is a modern movement, post-revolutionary
Then why
philosophy.
did you agree to my definition of feminism?
Because it's so broad that that's fine if you want to defend that against patriarchy, but I'm arguing patriarchy against feminism,
So
and
all
what
you're
you
doing
appealed
now
to
is moving the goalpost
what
by the
you
originally
ap-
agreeing to a
No.
definition of feminism, and now you're saying that can't work anymore because it's defeating my argument?
the Old Testament God and the New Testament God are the same God, and they never institute a feminist society. And women's rights are being made in the image of God, that women are protected now in that status.
What do you mean
is
by a
not
feminist
feminism.
society? What do you mean by a feminist society?
A matriarchal society
I'm
or,
not
a
advocating that.
non-patriarchal society.
I've never advocated for either of these things.
Okay, but feminism has never been a societal goal in the Old Testament or the New Testament or the history of any Christian society.
Again,
so you have
I
no
haven't
examples of
advocated-
this.
I haven't advocated for any of these things. I don't need
You
to.
appealed to God as your standard of the ought and
I
the
said it-
right, the moral right.
Yeah, it's a
right?
moral thing to treat
Correct.
women well.
And then I said, give me the examples of where that God ever instituted anything like what you're talking about in terms of
And I
feminism,
said
and there's
in-
not.
that
There's not.
There is, according to the definition you agreed to.
No,
on
there's not.
feminism. Yeah, the empowerment and promotion of femininity. Judaism.
That is not what is happening in the Old Testament.
Judaism
That
is
is not.
the most progressive approach to femininity of all of the ancient
Modern rabbinic
religions.
Judaism is not the same thing as what's in the
But
Mosaic Law.
you asked for
You
Old
admitted-
Testament
you
examples, which
admitted
I
it.
just gave you one.
That's not rabbinic Judaism. You admitted that it's a patriarchal society that's
What
a
do you
monarchy.
mean it's not rabbinic? You don't think Old Testament Judeo like
No, it's not.
it's not
different.
rabbinic? What are you talking about?
It's not the same thing as
You
rabbinic
don't think
Judaism.
that the 1200 BC society that was erected by King David wasn't a rabbinic society?
Rabbinic Judaism comes out of the 4th and 5th century when the Babylonian Talmud is collected and collated.
So you don't
That's
think
not,
that the Old Testament at
is
all
not rabbinic? No.
Okay.
And it's patriarchal. So even if it was rabbinic, it wouldn't
It's fine.
refute. Then there's no examples of what you're talking about.
Well, the issue for me is that what you're doing is you're creating a false dichotomy. You're pretending like patriarchy and feminism can't coexist at
Correct.
the same
They
time.
cannot.
Of course they can. We live in one.
Being feminine is not the same thing as the movement of feminism.
I didn't say that it is. I said that
You
we
did.
are.
You said that femininity is promoted in the Old Testament, and you used that as a way to prove your position.
I said it empowered women and it promoted femininity. It empowered women by creating matrilineal lines of inheritance, and it promoted femininity by making a whole bunch of female figures be viewed as these like incredible characters to like look up to, like Ruth and Deborah and stuff like that.
Okay, well, there's
Which, according to the definition you agreed to on feminism, would be feminism.
Then it wasn't, quote, progressive according to your view, because other societies worship the goddess, and that would be more progressive than what you said.
If you want, we can go back an hour and we can redo chatter, and you can make a new definition for feminism that you like more, so that you can apply it more narrowly if you'd like.
You have moved the goalpost.
I have not.
From
I wrote it
what
down.
Feminism is.
I wrote it down,
to be
and you agreed to it.
Anything that. So is the goddess feminism?
I don't know what the
Goddess worship in the ancient pagan world, is that feminism?
It might be.
Okay,
I'm not
thank
sure.
you.
I don't know anything
so your
about.
View,
Well, hold on.
So your
Hold
position
on.
is so elastic that it could encompass any
Then
possible
why did you
position.
agree to it?
It's unfault because the way you framed it was anti-patriarchy, and I'm fine with that.
I didn't frame it that way.
Yes, you did.
I did not frame it that
The
way.
terms of this debate
If you want to go back an
is
hour,
feminism good or is patriarchy good?
I wrote it down. Do you want to go
The
back
fact
an
that
hour?
you wrote it down just means that you misunderstand what you wrote down.
No,
that's even dumber.
The issue, rather than you just being bad faith for no reason,
No,
is
this
that
is good. You didn't even know what an internal critique is. So I'm not being bad faith. I've been debating for 25 years.
it's
not bad faith.
it's completely fine to know what terms are, right?
Sure, but in terms of debate, that's like 101, knowing what an internal critique is.
I understand what like consistency checks are. I just didn't use the language internal critique, right? So if we want to go back an hour, you agreed to this idea of chatter, right? How we want to define concepts, agree to them so that we can talk about
Women
ideas.
prattle or chatter? I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
So if you agree to that and then you agree to the terms, you can change them later. I'm just going to be good faith. You can change them later if you want to. Let's just go back to the terms again and narrow it down to what we can agree to of what feminism and patriarchy means. Because now, you're doing is...
I gave a very precise definition for patriarchy, right?
Sure, I did
And you
too.
gave a very loose definition as to what you think feminism is, which could encompass conceivably anything that helps women. And that's an ambiguity fallacy.
Then provide a different definition. Don't agree to it.
In my opening statement, I said that I believe feminism is a revolutionary philosophy that destroys society. It was brought about to change society in toto and ultimately to serve into oligarchical designs and people who, and I gave sources. You can read the Rockefeller's authorized biography. They have a whole discussion of Abby Rockefeller funding third wave feminism in Cell 16.
Sorry, how is this not just as ambiguous as the one? It's just a revolutionary
Just as ambiguous.
system?
I'm literally giving you the people who funded it and the actual names of the people, like Cell 16.
I don't know why you're appealing to. I don't know why you're appealing to authority right now. None of this matters.
No,
I'm
that's
asking
not an
for a
authority.
definition.
That's the people involved. It's not an authority appeal.
Yeah, if the people
don't know what an
who you
authority
think
appeal is.
funded them is an authority for the
I
definition
gave the
of
people
feminism,
involved, like Abby Rockefeller,
that
who
would
was
be an
herself.
authority.
No, it's not.
Then why are you citing them?
It's a person who's in the movement. It's not just the funder.
Yeah, you're appealing to authority.
You
right
don't know
now.
what an appeal to. That's a fact. It's not an appeal to authority. You don't know what an appeal to authority
You are citing them
is. This is so
for a
silly.
definition of feminism.
Yeah, that's not an appeal to authority.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
Yes,
you
it
don't
is.
know what an appeal to authority. If I said my position is true because I cite the Rockefellers, that would be an appeal to authority, and
You're
that's a
saying
fallacy.
This definition
this is an evidence
true
goofus.
because of the Rockefellers. If you want,
No, I'm not. I'm telling you
If
the
you wa-
history of the movement,
that
which
has
you don't
nothing-
even know
again,
about.
I've asked you to define feminism, and now
And
what
I'm
you're
giving
doing,
you the history of that movement,
I'm
which
asking
is
you for a
three
definition.
waves.
Why, I don't
Are
know-
there 3 waves of
Doofus,
feminism?
why can't you give me a definition?
Are there 3 waves of feminism?
There's 4.
Okay, so there's 3.
Oh, you didn't know that? That's crazy.
So there are 3, correct?
There's 4.
Right, but that would mean there's also 3, even though there's a 4th, right?
That's true. 3 is less than 4.
I
Good
know
job,
that,
Jay.
but the fact that there's 4, there's still 3 that have happened, right?
Irrelevant to anything
Irrelevant.
modern
Wait a minute.
feminism.
Is that an appeal to authority?
What authority am I citing right now? I know
Well, you're
really
citing facts that you think are appeals
Which
to
authority
authority.
have I cited? Name one. Name one authority I've cited, Jay.
You think-
Go. Name one authority I've
You
cited.
don't understand
Jay,
what,
name
I'm
one
making a
authority I've
joke.
cited.
I'm making a joke because
What's
you
the
think
authority I cited?
appealing to a fact is appeal to authority. Those are two
That's
different
not
things.
true.
Yes,
In fact,
it is.
when you were citing
If I talk
Rockefeller,
about,
when you're
listen,
citing
this is
Rockefeller
so stupid.
as the definition for feminism,
No, the
I'm saying you're appealing
funder
to
is not
authority.
the definition, you idiot.
Then why are you appealing to them in any way?
To prove the history of the movement
Do you know
and
what an
what
appeal
it
to authority
teaches.
fallacy is? Brian,
Yes,
do you know what an
I
appeal
just
to
gave you
authority
the
fallacy is?
example.
Okay.
I've been debating for 25 years. I know what the appeal to authority is. That's one right there.
Okay, so
See,
when
that's
you,
the appeal to authority
when you
fallacy.
appeal to irrelevant people that sound
It's
authoritative
not
but
irrelevant.
aren't relevant, the history
Do you know
of
why?
feminism
Do you
isn't
wanna-
relevant to you giving me a definition of feminism
is.
that I can operate
Is it
off
a
of.
historical movement?
Can you give me
Is it a
fucking
historical
definition?
movement?
Yeah, of course.
Then the history is relevant to the definition, you idiot.
Then give me the definition. You can do
Let's
it,
keep
Jay.
it nice if we can.
Oh my
You can do it,
gosh.
Jay. I
Maybe
believe
this
in
is
you.
like talking to a 5-year-old.
Yeah. Well, you're a big boy, so this should be really easy for you. Define feminism. Go ahead.
Feminism is a historical movement that's concerned with the rights of women, including egalitarianism, the idea that women and men are equal. If we go back to Wollstonecraft, if we go back to the suffrage movement, if we go back to the notion of women not being married at certain ages as children. So the first wave wanted not just suffragism, but they also wanted to not have child brides and that kind of stuff.
I'm really proud of you. You got
But they
two
also
things.
listen.
One more.
I'm not. Shut up.
We're super
Shut
close.
up and let me finish.
We're
I'm
super
not
close.
done.
Yeah, I
I'm
believe
not
you.
done. They also
believe me, I know you're not.
wanted better work hours. They wanted women to have inheritance rights. They wanted women to be able to
Okay, so
get
labor
jobs
rights.
and they wanted women in the workforce and to be in positions that they didn't have. So they wanted certain social rights
Okay,
that
so they
women
want-
did, like voting, right, suffrage, right? Those are all first wave.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
This is your definition of feminism? Okay, I'm writing it down.
Are you serious?
I'm so dumb.
You
I'm
asked
even writing
for the
it down
history
for
of it.
I
You-
didn't ask you for the history.
You
I
did-
asked you for a
you
definition.
said that it's historical.
Okay,
and I'm
rights
giving
of
you the
women,
movements.
I'm not asking for the history. I'm asking
You
for you to,
said it is historical, so I have to go back to the people.
No,
You're so dumb that you can't conceive of a position apart from the people
I'll do something
who came
different.
up with the
Watch.
position.
I'll do so. Israel. I can define Israel without
What does this
going
have to
through
do-
the entire history of Israel. Feminism, while it
No, you
does
can't.
have,
Actually,
yes,
you
of
can't.
course you can.
No,
because
this is
for the
so
sake
silly
of conversation,
because you
we have to
admitted it's
agree
a
what
historical
construct is.
movement. Therefore, it can't be divorced from the people in history.
I'm not asking
Do you
to
think it
divorce
came
it.
out of the sky?
You're
Did it come
again,
into
this is a
people's
false
minds out of the
dichotomy.
sky
This
or
is a
from the
false
people?
dichotomy. You're doing a false dichotomy again.
What are you, dude? You don't
You're,
even.
you're
this is
acting
so
like
crazy.
you're acting like you can't define it without the history. I'm telling
Correct. It's a historical movement by your own
you.
definition.
That doesn't mean that you can't make a definition for the word,
Yes,
so
you
we
have
can
to
just
go
talk
to the
about
people.
it.
Where do you think words come from? From people.
That
They
doesn't
don't
mean-
drop out of the sky. They come
Jay,
from people.
Jay, I know you can do this. You can define a word without giving me a 5-minute
you
monologue
can't.
on the history.
No, you can't.
So there's no way for you to define feminism.
Would you go to a
without
dictionary?
history.
That's an appeal to authority.
It's not an appeal
Yes,
to
it is.
authority. Okay, there are appeal to authorities that are fallacious, and there are appeal to authorities that are
Oh,
non-fallacious.
like when I give the examples of the
Rockefeller
funders,
as
the
a
funders of
funder
it.
is not an appeal.
It's not
a
just a
legitimate-
funder. Abby was involved in Cell 16. She's not just a funder.
That doesn't matter. That
It
doesn't
does
mean,
because it came from them.
that doesn't mean that she's a relevant authority to cite.
The one who funded it and got it going at Chicago University is
Funded
not relevant.
portions of the third wave. Yes,
Correct.
that doesn't mean that
No,
she
it
gets
comes
to
out of her money.
No, that doesn't mean
millions
that-
of dollars at
again,
Chicago University.
That doesn't mean that she's the definer of feminism.
I didn't say she was. I said she's.
You cited her as a definer of feminism.
She's involved in the third
What's
wave
the
movement.
definition of
and-
feminism, Jay?
Oh
You
my
can do
gosh,
it.
you're so stupid.
I've got
You
3 things from you so far.
even do a
Feminism
rational
equals
conversation.
rights of women. Men and women are
You
equal.
admitted-
labor rights.
I
I've
mentioned
got 3 things. What
I
else is
mentioned
feminism? We can do
inheritance
this, Jay.
in terms of first wave feminism. I mentioned
yeah.
child age of marriage as another element of it.
Okay, so
in terms of the first wave.
Civil rights. Let's just call those civil rights.
That's not civil rights. It's oh my gosh. It's
How is that not
prior to
civil
the
rights?
civil rights movement. You idiot.
That doesn't mean that it's not civil rights, Jay. I'm just trying to create a way to make this succinct so we can get a fucking definition because you don't like mine, which is fine.
I said yours.
That's why I'm just
yours
trying to
is
now
too
get a new
broad.
one. That's fine. Make your own.
I'm giving the historical.
I
I
don't
don't
want the
need
history.
my own definition.
Yes,
It's
you
your
do.
position, you goofus.
No.
You debate
Jay,
positions
Jay,
like when you
Jay,
debated Jim Bob,
Jay.
and you tell people to define your position. This is how silly you are.
No, Jay.
You
I gave
a broad definition.
I gave you a definition, and you
Which
don't
is too
like
broad.
it. That's
No.
fine. Make your own definition, and then we can
I
work
don't
from
need
there.
to make a definition.
Yes,
It's
you
not
do.
my position.
If you have
It's a
rejected my definition, you now have to supply one.
Yes, I'm going to the people who came up with it. Correct.
Rockefeller didn't
historically.
come up with it.
I said Mary Wollstonecraft in my opening statement is one of the first feminists in modern society.
Do you want to supply a definition? This doesn't matter, Jay. Just make a
does it?
definition.
So the people who came up with it don't matter.
They matter if you can get to getting a definition out of your fucking mouth. We've got
I've been giving you
We've got four
four.
elements of
Thank you.
feminism now. Okay, so we've got rights of women, like men and women are equal, egalitarianism, labor rights, and civil rights. Is there anything else you would like to add to that definition?
As we move into modernity, we get more radical versions of this, particularly with Cell 16, which becomes almost a revolutionary terrorist movement, which wants to engage in radical action and Skittles rights, shall we say. So they move into it being Skittles as well.
Okay, so
now, I don't care if you reject
trans rights.
I don't care if you reject that or accept that. Because I'm looking at this as a historical movement, because guess what? Feminism is a historical movement. That's what we're debating.
You might not believe me, Jay. I'm so disappointed about this conversation. I talked about chatter because I was interested in a good
You
discussion.
keep saying chatter doesn't have anything to do with the fact that I did an internal critique and you didn't know what that was. And then I start going to the history of feminism
You're just
and then
saying
you're
stuff
floundering.
right now. You're just saying
I'm just
stuff right
saying
now.
stuff.
Yeah.
There we go.
So going to chatter, the reason I asked you about it is so that we could have a decently good conversation so that we weren't quibbling over the definition of words and we could actually engage in conversation. If the only way that you can debate for the last 25 years is to just quibble about semantics of words, I'm sorry, you're not a king debater. You're just bad faith.
You asked me for the last 30 minutes to define a word. So you're the one that's quibbling about semantics.
I'm
That's
not
semantics.
quibbling. I'm literally not quibbling. I am writing down your word.
Oh, so if you're writing it down.
I'm granting. It's not semantics because I'm just granting your
I
definition.
thought it was semantics. No, it's not.
It's not semantic debating because I'm not disagreeing with you on your definition. I'm literally begging you to just give me one. I'm begging you at this point because you don't like mine. So let's give yours.
I don't care what
Rights
your
of women.
definition is because all I have to do is critique your position internally and point out that
You
it's
do have
so
to care
ambiguous.
about my definition if you're going to do an internal critique. That's the fundamental of a fucking internal critique. Is that
Oh, now
have
you
to
do know
use my
about. So you
definitions.
just learned about an internal critique about 10 minutes ago, and
Yeah.
now you're going to lecture me on it.
You're a really good teacher, Jay. What
Thank
can I
you.
say? So
The debate's over.
you do care
She
about.
admitted she's learning.
You
in the
do
debate.
care about feminism and my definition of it because you need it for the internal critique, which you've already
I
acknowledged.
don't care about it because
but
it
now
doesn't-
you've
it
rejected
doesn't
my
act-
definition
oh
of
my God.
feminism. So again, I know being mean to women is your fallback if you have nothing
there we
else
go,
to
ad
do.
hominem now, so there we go.
It's not an ad hominem. I didn't say that
Being
you're
mean to you?
No,
Who's being mean to
I
you?
didn't say you're wrong because you're being an asshole. I just said you're an asshole.
Now you're getting your feelings
That's
hurt.
not an ad hominem. My feelings
It's
are
not
fine.
an ad hominem.
No. Insulting people and being mean isn't ad hom. You should know this. You can Google it. Google it at home. An ad hom is when you use the insult of a person to discredit them. So if I said, Jay, you're wrong because you're mean, now I'm ad homing you. As a debate bro of 25 years, you should know your fallacies better. You've already been wrong about multiple fallacies.
Really?
And you can't, can't define feminism. Do you want to get there?
You've already admitted that I gave you four elements.
It seems like you have more.
So
five, actually.
I think that
it seems
you
like you have
actually
more
think
that you want to add.
You
to.
actually think like
Or are you happy
maybe
with this
a
definition?
100 IQ person that the way that you define something is you literally just look at a definition in a dictionary and then you just list it out, and that's the definition of the word.
False.
That's
false.
Really?
I've never said
Because
that.
I'm giving you the entire
Jay?
context of the history of feminism,
Why?
and you're saying, I need a fucking definition.
Yes.
As we're working through the actual history of it and the definition of
because
what
again,
it is.
To give me
You admitted that it's a historical movement, didn't
that
you?
has nothing to do with you giving me a definition so that we can talk about it.
that it's a historical
Of course, Jay.
movement,
Yeah.
so the history has to do with it, you idiot.
I don't need the history for you to give me a definition, you
we
idiot.
have to go to the people who are the philosophers of it.
You can just define
Like
it.
Mary Wollstonecraft and her positions.
You can just
like
define it.
egalitarianism.
You can just define it. So
I'm
we can
defining
fucking
it
move
for
on.
you. I've been defining it, and you just keep yapping and melting down over your notes.
Well, the issue is that it has taken me pushing you to be specific over and over for 45 minutes. We have 5 points now.
Because you don't
for
have
feminism.
anything other than this.
That's false.
How
I
does
gave
any
you
of
multiple
this
definitions.
prove your position that feminism is good for society?
Honestly,
As a feminist,
can we
you're
get there?
showing us that you're not good for society. So you're actually proving my point as you yap and argue. You're
That's actually a
proving my
great
point.
example of an ad
Yes,
hom.
that is actually
That is an ad hom,
That is an but it's an illustrative ad hominem. Yes, correct.
That's true. It was a very creative ad hom. Okay, so we have 5 points that you would like to define feminism. Is there any other points that you want to define feminism with?
Yes,
Is there
the
anything
people
else?
who funded that also said that they like the movement because it destroys the nuclear family, gets women in the workforce, taxes the other half of the population, and reduces the population because there's less families.
How do you want to summarize that?
Why do I have
destruction
to?
of
You
nuclear
can't remember
family?
what I just
So
said?
feminism
You can't
is-
remember 4 sentences I just said?
No, I can remember. I just want to you're you're just very yappy, and so I'd like to
I'm
make
yappy.
it succinct. Yes,
I'm yappy.
to give me a definition, you've had to give me an entire century's worth of history, even
You mean,
though.
like when you admitted that it's a historical movement, so it can't be
Here's the
it
thing,
can't
Jay.
be divorced from the
You
historical
know what you
people?
could have done? You could have just said to me, so that we can move forward with this conversation. Feminism is
Yeah,
rights.
but I'm not going to
Is
grant
rights
you.
of women, men
it's
and
a
women
debate,
are equal, labor
so I'm not
rights,
going to
civil
grant
rights,
you
and trans rights.
simple answers in a debate.
Why
to
wouldn't
help
you just define a word?
I
Well,
don't
if we
owe
can,
you
if
a
we can,
definition.
maybe we could avoid some of the insults, and if we can, also allow people to finish their thought. Let's try to
Okay, are you
not
happy?
do interruptions, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah,
So
are
I
you?
want to know how any of this helps your case to prove feminism is good for society.
Well, we can get there now that we've defined feminism. So destruction of nuclear family is another one that you would like to add to
Sure.
the definition of feminism.
That's why the people who fund it matter, is because they say that.
Okay, I would argue that the destruction of nuclear families is not inherent to most feminist movements and is bad. So I reject that part of your definition.
So the people who want that in society and say that it does that don't matter. Because you have
They're not the feminism that I'm fighting
because you have a definition that is so elastic to make it anything that you think helps women. And that's why I've said you've already lost the debate, because you're elastic.
The
It's not
empowerment.
specific.
You define.
That's why I asked you
empowerment
that
of
open
women and
statement.
promotion of femininity. So empowerment means things
That
like
is
removing obstacles.
ambiguous.
And promotion of
It's
femininity would be
ambiguous.
like making feminine traits viewed as respect-worthy.
Like submitting to authority in men? Is that a feminine trait?
No, I would not say so.
So it's not clear. It's ambiguous.
I would say
so it's,
submission is.
you have to
feminine.
define it.
I would say submission's feminine, but I don't think
to-
it's to men specifically. No.
Oh, okay.
It would be like to any authority, right?
To any authority.
Yeah.
Are most authority men?
A lot of them are, but some are
So it
women.
would be to men.
Nope, it would be to authority.